Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Doris Kearns Goodwin is one of America's most beloved historians. She spoke with us last time about her new book, An Unfinished Love Story, a personal history of the 1960s. Our conversation is also unfinished, so we will continue with that on today's program. I spoke with Doris Kearns Goodwin before a sold-out audience at a Northshire bookstore event held at Universal Preservation Hall in Saratoga Springs, New York. You write, as the season of politics began in earnest in the spring and summer of 1964, Lyndon Johnson was so harassed by what the White House termed the Bobby problem, the selection of his running mate for the coming campaign, that it became a full-blown obsession.
What happened is that, people thought, and Bobby thought maybe, that he would become vice president, that John Kennedy's brother would carry the Kennedy tradition, and that Lyndon Johnson would need him as vice president. People were starting to say, make him vice president, and he felt under terrible pressure, Johnson did. And then finally, when it turned out that Goldwater was the nominee, he knew that he didn't need liberal Bobby as his vice president because Goldwater was so far to the extreme on the right-hand side. So he was able to just tell Bobby, he doesn't want to tell Bobby alone, you can't get it. So he makes this great statement, nobody who's a member of my cabinet will be part of my vice presidential choice, which of course got Bobby Kennedy undone. And Bobby was disappointed. He really thought, I think, that he could be vice president. But meanwhile, we have to get my husband to working for LBJ because it's a funny story. It has to do with the naked guys in the pool.
There is a point where you're talking about you later, much later in the book, where you're working with LBJ. This is after is no longer president, and you're working on his memoirs. And the two of you were in the pool, and I was like, she's clothed, right?
Clearly, and he's clothed
okay.
For me.
Well, there you go.
But what happens, if I may tell the story, is that Dick was never quite sure what it was that made LBJ call him to come over and try and be a speechwriter for him until we found one of the tapes, one of the LBJ tapes with Bill Moyers. He's talking to Bill Moyers in March of '64. Kennedy's been dead since November. And he says, I need a speechwriter here. I need somebody who could put sex into my speeches, whatever that meant. There's somebody who could put rhythm into my speeches, somebody who can write great Churchillian phrases. Who could that be? And Moyers says, we hear this on the tape. Well, the only one I know is Goodwin, because they'd worked together in the Peace Corps. And he said, but he's not one of us. And what Moyers meant by that was he was a Kennedy, not a Johnson. But he invited him to work on a message on poverty. And then he becomes eventually the main speechwriter. A month later or so, Moyers gets Dick, and he says, the president wants to talk to us about his Johnson program. This tax cut, which was Kennedy's, had gotten through. The Civil Rights Bill was getting through. And he wants to have a Johnson program, and he wants a name for whatever this Johnson program is going to be. So Dick says, are we meeting him in the Oval Office? He said, no, we're going to the swimming pool. So they go to the White House pool. Johnson is in the pool naked, stark naked, swimming up and down, side-stroking. Dick said he looked like a whale going up and down. So then the two of them are standing there with their suits on and the ties. Johnson said, well, come on in, guys. And so they have nothing to do but strip as well. Now you sort of three guys naked swimming in the pool. Finally, Johnson pulls over to the side, and they're hanging onto the side, and he outlines all the things that he really wants to do. He knew it from the first night he was in office. He wanted Medicare. He wanted aid to education. He wanted civil rights. He wanted voting rights. He wanted immigration reform. It was extraordinary. And so they decide that he's going to make a speech at the University of Michigan. They put a date on it. This is the way you get something to happen in government. You know you're going to make a speech, so you have to come up with the program that you're going to be talking about. And so it's going to be May 22nd. And it was kind of chutzpah to go to the University of Michigan because that's where, of course, the Peace Corps had happened. So it was a kind of competitive thing. He goes to the graduation there, and it's Dick's responsibility to work on the speech. And then they have to come up with a name for what is this program going to be. They didn't have a name for it. So various people in the White House wanted a better deal than a new deal. Some people wanted a glorious society. But Dick tried out in some small speeches a great society, just in not even capital letters, but I want to build a great society where affluence is shared by many more people and where, inequality is dealt with and poverty is dealt with. And finally, it became the Great Society. So that's where it was born, three naked guys in the pool.
It's just the idea of Johnson standing there naked, thinking of all of these amazing ideas.
It is true that when I talked about the first time I went to the ranch, which was on Memorial Day in 1968. And I could see in these daily diaries, you get these daily diaries, which I didn't have at the time, which tell what he does every minute of every day. And I saw myself, okay, I'm in the pool with him at midnight. I'm in the pool at 8 in the morning. And I do remember that we were fully clothed in that pool. But he just wanted to talk. He wanted to talk to me. I mean, he just loved talking about luckily the chapters that I was working on in the memoir were on civil rights and Congress. So they were the two happy parts of his presidency. He knew then that his legacy in the war in Vietnam had been cutting his legacy in two. And as a result, he was happy talking to me about the early days when he was a congressman, when he was in the NYA, when he was such a force. And I listened to him, and I like to believe that that's why he's spending so many hours with me, because I was listening to his great stories and I was a good listener. I also thought maybe part of it was because I was from Harvard, and he had a thing about Harvard and Yale. I was a graduate student at Harvard at the time before I met him. And he used to say that his father had told him, if you brush up against the grindstone of life, you'll have more polish than any Harvard or Yale man ever had. And he said, but I never believed him. And so I think part of it was that I was at Harvard, but part of it was I worried that I was a young woman, and he had somewhat of a reputation. So I constantly chattered to him about steady boyfriends, even when I had no boyfriends at all. And everything was working perfectly until one day he said he wanted to discuss our relationship, which sounded ominous. He took me to the lake nearby called Lake LBJ, wine, cheese, red check tablecloth, all the romantic trappings. And he started out, Doris, more than any other woman I have ever known, and my heart sank. And then he said, you remind me of my mother. So.
Well, what every young woman wants to hear, right? Absolutely.
Anyway, it was such a lucky thing. Those conversations with him, they set me on my path to be a presidential historian.
You're listening to a conversation with Doris Kearns Goodwin about her new book, An Unfinished Love Story, A Personal History of the 1960s. You write so often in the book, and it's so funny because he would talk, and then you'll say, and talk, and talk, and talk, and talk, and talk. And that was him. Just wind him up.
He talked from the moment he waked up till the moment he went to sleep. He could never be alone. There were times, even when he was taking a nap, when he wanted me, it sounds crazy, but it was happening at the time, to sit in his closet so that somebody would be there. So I had a chair in the closet just in case he woke up. I mean, just worried that if something ever happened to him. He had his father who'd had an early heart attack, and he worried about being alone. So I was there. He needed companionships. Lady Bird used to say to me sometimes that she was so glad because I could be there. She could go shopping, or she could work on her memoirs. Somebody had to be with him every moment of time. But we've gotten off, Dick.
Well, let's talk about the of being a speechwriter and working on the Great Society, because the agenda is written and you know what is working through. But as a speechwriter, I mean, Dick is so much setting the tone for all of this. You write about this several times where LBJ would say, well, get Goodwin to do it, and then he would write a page, they'd hand it off to him, and certain notes were made. But these ideas were coming from your husband.
I think what Dick would argue, I mean, we can use the voting rights speech as an example.
Yeah.
He would argue that the convictions came from LBJ, that he knew what LBJ cared about, that you could not write a speech for somebody unless it was authentic to the person. Obviously, the way he would write for JFK would be different from the way he would write for LBJ. I think the most important thing that Dick did, which he would be proudest of ever in his life, was to work on the voting rights speech to the joint session of Congress after Selma. What had happened in Selma, much has happened in Birmingham, which is what inspired JFK to finally know that something had to happen to end segregation. The civil rights movement was arguing that there were all manner of, this was in 1965 now, all manner of reasons why blacks were being denied the right to vote in the South. They would make you to register. You'd have to say what the 13th Amendment was, the 17th Amendment, how many seeds were there in a watermelon, things that could not possibly be answered. You'd be denied registration. And as a result, Selma was picked by Martin Luther King because it had one of the worst records. All through the South, the same thing was happening. 3/5 of the city was black, and only 2% were registered. So they were marching from Selma to Montgomery to argue about the right to vote. And as you all remember, we've gone through it so many times in the anniversaries, the Alabama State Troopers met them as John Lewis was bringing the marchers along with whips and billy clubs and horses that went over the fallen bodies, and it was all captured on television. I remember watching in graduate school, and I couldn't believe this was my country, and that fired the conscience of the country. So Johnson knew then he would make a speech immediately on the need for a Voting Rights Act, which meant that Dick, as the speechwriter, had only one day to work on that speech because he decided on a Sunday night he would do it on Monday night. And all day they said to Dick, what do you need for the pressure to be relieved? He said, serenity. No one can come in the room, and I will send the pages out to the president. He will edit them. They'll come back in, but nobody can bother me. So anyway, he worked on that speech, and he always knew he wanted to have a big line to start every speech, and he certainly came up with one. He started out saying, I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. I mean, what an incredible line to begin that speech, right? And then he said, then he put it in history. At times, history and fate meet at a certain place in a certain time in man's unending search for freedom. So it was in Lexington and Concord. So it was at Appomattox. So it was in Selma, Alabama. And then this is not a Negro problem, not a white problem, not a Northern problem, not a Southern problem. It's not a constitutional problem. Command of the Constitution is plain. It is not a moral problem. It is simply wrong to deny your fellow Americans the right to vote. But then he said, but even if we do get the right to vote, then for the just blessings of American society to be there for Black America, he was calling them the Negro Americans, we will have to overcome centuries of bigotry and injustice. But if we work together, we shall overcome. There was a moment of silence. That meant that the Freedom Marchers' anthem, We Shall Overcome, was being taken to the highest chambers of power, and then the audience erupted in crying and screaming. It was an extraordinary moment. Then there was still more to come, because the only time Johnson had bothered him, he called him up, and Dick said it was the softest voice he'd ever heard from Lyndon Johnson. He said, I'd like to talk about Cotulla. And Dick knew what that had meant because he'd been to the ranch. He knew what this meant. When LBJ was in college, he took a year off to teach at a small Mexican-American school in Cotulla, Texas. And the kids were poor. They came to school hungry. He could see that somehow they knew that people didn't like them. He said, it's a terrible thing to see the scar of prejudice on a young person's face. And I want to talk about Cotulla, he said to Dick. So a wonderful passage was written in which LBJ said, in 1928, when I was there was so much I wanted to do for those kids, but all I could do was he'd given part of his salary to get gym equipment for them, but that was it. But now he said, it's 1965, and I'm standing here, and I am President of the United States, and I have the power, and I intend to use it. And incredible. 5 months later, the Voting Rights Act passed.
5 months later.
5 months later, it passed, and we had on our wall, and I brought it after my husband died to my place in Boston now, and it's the picture of Dick getting one of the pens, and the pen is there to sign that signed the Voting Rights Act. So that was his proudest moment, and I think it was such an important moment for America. More importantly.
So as you started the answer, you said that you have to have the convictions of the president, obviously, but there's also the convictions of Dick in there too.
His convictions about what he was hoping for the country, not only with the Voting Rights Act, but for the Great Society. I mean, Medicare and Medicaid and NPR and PBS, that all happens right there, right? The National Foundation of the Arts, it's all there. Spreading arts and literature to other people in the country. It wasn't simply for elites. And that was Johnson, and that was Dick as well. No, I'm very proud of him. He was an extraordinary husband, this man.
When did things start to go wrong between Dick and LBJ?
Well, they actually started going wrong even before the war, in the sense that in 1965, finally, even after he'd been there, for a year and a half, he really wanted to go and start a writing career. He'd always wanted to be a writer. So Dick got a fellowship at Wesleyan that was supposed to start in the fall of '65, and he told Johnson about it in maybe June. And Johnson at first he just said, well, you can't go. He said, there's a statue I have, and he pulls it out, a little law that's here, that you can draft somebody if you need them for public service, for vital things. He says, and Dick thought, is this really true? And then he called McNamara, and he found out there is such a thing, that if you could need somebody for special projects. Then he said, well, what do you need? He said, well, do you need more money? I'll get you more money from the foundation. All of it was incentives and fine. But then after Dick persisted in wanting to go, then Johnson really really turned mean, turned against him, said bad things about him. When he left, there was a sadness in it, but much worse happened, which is that after Dick left, he turned against the war, became the first administration official to talk against the war, and then he became friendly with Bobby Kennedy, and that was the worst part of it all. He knew that Bobby and he were friends. Bobby had turned against the war, and he was sure that Dick had written all those speeches. And it left with a really sad feeling between the two of them. That's why I'm so happy that through the boxes it began to feel better. I remember seeing Lucy Johnson at the premiere of the play All the Way, where Cranston played LBJ so well. It was an incredible thing. It was when it was an HBO's thing as well as a play, and it was in Austin. And Lucy said to me, she called him Daddy. She said, "Did Dick ever forgive Daddy?" And I knew even then that he had begun to come through his side of it. And then later, when one time I was on television talking about the anniversary of the signing of the Voting Rights Act, and Lucy called me up. She's incredible, Lucy is. She called me up, so she's like her father. She called me, she said, "I know that your Dick and my daddy are up there in heaven, and they're so proud of you talking about the Voting Rights Act today." So she said, "I'm so glad they got together."
And then we see this relationship with Bobby as things with LBJ sour, and in 68.
What a year. I mean, it's true. What happened is that in 68, Dick had been hoping that Bobby would run for the presidency in 67, and Bobby kept thinking about it, but then he was worried that he'd just be looking like he was going against LBJ. He would be dividing the Democratic Party in two, so he kept hesitating. But by that time, Dick thought something has to be done to stop the war. So McCarthy had entered the candidacy in New Hampshire, and Dick told Bobby, "If you're not going to do it, I'm going up there with McCarthy." So he did. He went up with his typewriter, just said to McCarthy, "I'm here to help." And he was very involved in McCarthy's New Hampshire primary. He loved that campaign. The kids came from all over the country, and these were anti-war kids who had a mission and a discipline. They came, they worked 24 hours a day. They cut their beards, their long hair. The girls wore long dresses. They went to every Democratic home in New Hampshire and simply talked to the people. It was a hawkish state. They couldn't really win them over on the war, but they could win them over on the chaos that the country was in and all the things that were happening in the anti-war movement in the streets and the cities. And don't you want a stable person to let go forward? And as a result, he won 42% in New Hampshire, and that led 2 weeks later to Lyndon Johnson deciding to have a major speech on the war where he was going to stop the bombing, negotiate some sort of peace, and he withdrew from the race. And so that really worked. That anti-war movement worked. And then what happened, it's so sad, and every time I think about it, it makes me sad. Johnson later told me that that was some of the happiest days in his life, because once he made that decision, the Washington Post, the New York Times, they all wrote editorials. He's putting the country's future more than his own. Here's this man who loves politics more than anything, is willing to give it up to try and get some peace in Vietnam. And he went through the streets in the next days. This was March 31st, April 1st, April 2nd. He's on the streets. People have signs, "Thank you, Johnson," instead of, hey, how many kids have you killed today? And then on April 3rd, North Vietnam sent a word that they were willing to go to the peace talks. And so then he had a whole plane filled of White House aides. They were going to go to Hawaii on April 4th. Johnson was going to join the plane later that night because he had a dinner to go to. And then at 5:30 that night, he gets word that Martin Luther King had been killed. And then everything seemed to fall apart. There were riots in the streets. He couldn't go to Hawaii. 2 months later, Bobby Kennedy was killed. And then the chaos is reigning. And then the peace talks get stalled. And then the Democratic Convention takes place. And Dick is there in charge of the peace plank. He goes back to McCarthy then after Bobby had died, still caring about the war. I was just there on a vacation from working on the White House with friends of mine who were all there as well. And again, one of those other times when we didn't meet, when we thought we almost could have met. And then it all disintegrated. I mean, then other people were there besides the peaceful McCarthy kids who were there, who were just there for mayhem and disturbance. Outsiders had come. And then the police were all ginned up, and there was a police riot, and we saw all of that. And Teddy White, the reporter, said that night when you had Humphrey on the screen, he was then winning, of course, and on the other side was the riots in the streets, that the Democratic Party had lost the election that night. The law and order campaign of Richard Nixon was successful. So that's the scenario we got to be careful of, whatever's going to happen this summer at the Democratic Convention, because we're already getting permits for marches there, and it could be a problem. But we could have learned from history. They could read and know. If you're going to go there, you have to stay peaceful, and you can't take over places, and you can't go without the permit and just stay with what you're allowed to do.
But it seems to be a dark cloud hanging over the event.
We still have time to know what's going to happen. There's talk now of a ceasefire. Maybe something will happen that will allow a breathing space for what's going on. We still got to hope that. Because it would be so important that these conventions just be held. I don't know, who's going to know? One of the things you learn from '68 is no one could have predicted in March that Lyndon Johnson would not be a candidate, that it would not be Bobby Kennedy or McCarthy, that it would be Humphrey, and that Bobby would be dead. There's still so much time. I don't know how to predict what's going to happen. Everything is so turbulent right now. So that's why I go back to these early turbulent times and know we got through them, because it gets scary when you think about it.
Our guest on the book show this week, Doris Kearns Goodwin, her new book, An Unfinished Love Story, published by Simon & Schuster.
It wasn't until I finished listening to it that I realized, then I went back to the book to check this, an entire book about the 1960s, 400 pages, you only mention Nixon's name 7 times. Good for you. Tells you, here's this major, certainly a major figure of the 70s, but
correct.
My goodness, is there he is, and yet all of this other stuff happens.
Yeah, I think that's, again, the importance of writing only what you know at the time. That's one of the things Barbara Tuchman, who was a heroine of mine, said, that even if you're writing about a war as a historian, you have to imagine you do not know how that war ended, so you can carry your reader with you every step along the way. We know that Nixon's going to emerge as a major figure. I'm not sure we fully realized that at the time, certainly. He's at the beginning, obviously, the debate so Nixon's, in fact, he's probably more in the beginning than he is in the end. I probably only mentioned him that he wins the election in the end, because I didn't want to know that yet. I wanted to just know what we knew.
But it was also interesting as far as his thoughts on the war and how that had an impact on the election.
Oh, yeah. What you find out later, which we didn't know at the time, is that finally in the fall, there was beginning to have some traction in the peace talks. And North Vietnam, who had been the intransigent one, was willing to make whatever compromises they were going to make. And then suddenly the South Vietnamese decided they won't go to the bargaining table. And we later discovered that Nixon, through an intermediary, had told the South Vietnamese, hold out, I'll give you a better deal. It's treasonous what he did. And people have argued that later on. And Johnson knew about it, and they were wondering why he didn't do something about it. It would have changed everything maybe, but it would have also been a terrible thing to have to accuse somebody. You could never be sure, is this really true? Later they've had correspondence to know that it did happen. So who knows, maybe, and then the war went on for year and year and years after that.
What are your thoughts about debates? How important have they been? Have they been diluted to a point where the importance has been nullified?
They certainly have been important in the past. Obviously, this first big debate between Nixon and Kennedy, since such a close election, it probably did make a difference. It was so interesting to be, what Dick and I decided when we got up to the box about the debate was, he said, okay, let's get a bottle of wine and have a debate night, and we'll watch the debate. We'll watch it again on YouTube, which we could. And then I remember when we started watching it, he said to me, are you anxious? Who do you think's going to win? And we had to pretend we didn't know. And he was very involved with Sorensen in preparing Kennedy for that debate. And the story is so interesting. They gave Kennedy 3x5 cards where he would have the potential question, the answer, counter by Nixon, answer to that, and memorize them. That's how it would be. And then as he was doing it one morning in bed while he had breakfast, and they're in there watching him, and as he finishes each card, he just flipped it on the floor like a solitaire card. They're going on the floor. And later, Dick went back because he had left some of his notes in Kennedy's hotel room, and he finds that Kennedy's in a nap. He'd fallen asleep in a nap the day this speech is going to take place that night. And Dick was so afraid he'd wake him up, and that would be the end of it all, but he snuck away from there. But we talked about how relaxed Kennedy was. He gets there, and as we all know, when you listen to it on radio, Nixon did pretty well. But watching them, Nixon was so uneasy. His makeup was falling down. His legs were splayed. They weren't in the right direction. Kennedy was relaxed. And that's what made an impression physically. But it was more than that. Kennedy became an instant celebrity. Dick said the next day when they went out on the campaign trail, he'd had good crowds before that. Suddenly they were screaming, the crowds. They were breaking through the barricades. It was whatever that crazy thing is about television, that you're on a box and all of a sudden you were there in person the day before, and now you're something different because you were on that box the night before. And so his crowds grew greater, his confidence grew greater, and that affected those last weeks too. So important was that speech, and so telling, that obviously nobody was willing to do it again until 1976, when Ford was behind and he'd agreed to debate. And then he probably lost ground to Carter because he made some mistake about Eastern Europe. I think sometimes, what one thing can be said in a debate that makes such a difference is kind of crazy compared to, we should be judging the candidates. Before Tim Russert died, he and I talked about the fact that the way we judge our candidates during our campaigns doesn't really make a lot of sense. Who says what in a debate? Who has raised the most money? Who might make a funny remark or something? When what matters is the temperament and the quality of the person. And they all were something before. And that's still true today. They all had shown what kind of leader they were, wherever they were, whether in business or private or public life before. And we shouldn't just be reading a magazine article about them. We should be looking at the qualities. I mean, I think about this so much because every leader that I've studied, people keep asking me, is there a master key to leadership? And there is no master key, but there's a family resemblance of leadership traits that we should be looking for in our candidates. And what do they have to do with humility, the ability to acknowledge errors and learn from your mistakes, empathy, most importantly, empathy for understanding and feeling other people's points of view, resilience to get back from adversity. Hemingway said, everyone's broken by life, but afterwards some are stronger in the broken places. You need accountability, people who take responsibility, people whose word is their bond, who you can trust what they say. And you need people for whom the ambition for the greater good is greater than the ambition for themselves. Just ask yourself, does this candidate have those qualities?
Again, Doris Kearns Goodwin's latest is an unfinished love story, a personal history of the 1960s. It is published by Simon & Schuster. You can hear this and part one of our conversation by going to wamc.org. The latest on National Productions programs is available there as well via the Airwaves newsletter and on social media at WAMC Radio. Thanks to our producer, Sarah LeDuc. Thanks to Northshire Bookstore, northshire.com, and Universal Preservation Hall at uph.org. Bookmark us for next week. And thanks for listening for The Book Show. I'm Joe Donahue.